Canada just turned a trade problem into a powerful advantage. America was counting on cheap supplies, but that supply is suddenly becoming harder to get. Now buyers from around the world are chasing the same resource, and Canada is gaining leverage fast. American refineries bought Canadian heavy crude at a steep discount, cheap oil they could count on, sold at whatever price they were willing to pay. That era just ended. A single pipeline opened Canada's oil to the entire Pacific, and suddenly buyers in China, Japan, South Korea, and India are bidding for the same barrels. When the Strait of Hormuz was disrupted, prices exploded, and America found itself competing for the crude it once got on the cheap. For most of the past decade, Western Canadian Select, the benchmark price for Alberta's heavy oil sands crude, traded at discounts to West Texas Intermediate that routinely reached $20, $25, and at various points as much as $40 per barrel below the American benchmark. That gap was enormous, and it was not an accident. It existed because Canadian crude had nowhere else to go but south. American refineries were the only serious buyers at scale, so they set the price, and Canadian producers accepted it. In early 2026, that discount narrowed to roughly $12 to $15 per barrel as the Trans Mountain expansion delivered its first full year of Pacific Coast export capacity. Then came the shock that closed the gap almost entirely. The Iran conflict disrupted shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, and Western Canadian Select moved in a way that would have been impossible before May 2024. The price surged toward levels that erased roughly 80% of the historic discount in a matter of weeks. American refineries that had spent 40 years buying Canadian heavy crude at bargain prices suddenly found themselves competing with Asian buyers for the very same barrels and paying for it. The cheap oil America had always taken for granted was no longer cheap and no longer guaranteed. The structural change that made this possible was the Trans Mountain expansion. Before May 2024, Canada's export pipeline capacity to Tidewater was effectively zero for crude beyond the original limited Trans Mountain line. Nearly all Alberta production flowed south into the American market through the Enbridge Main Line and other systems, arriving at Midwest and Gulf Coast refineries with no alternative buyer competition to support prices. The expansion changed that overnight. It increased the Trans Mountain system's throughput from roughly 294,000 barrels per day before the expansion to an average of 847,000 barrels per day in the fourth quarter of 2024, an increase of 553,000 barrels per day reaching the Pacific coast. Those barrels no longer had to be sold at whatever American refineries were willing to pay. They could be loaded onto tankers at the Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby and shipped directly to Chinese, South Korean, Japanese, and Indian refineries, all bidding for the same supply. The scale of that shift is captured in one figure. Tanker lifts from Westridge jumped from roughly 5 per month before the expansion to approximately 35 per month after full commercial service began. 35 tankers of Canadian crude leaving for Asia every month is what moved the WCS-WTI differential. American refineries had been the only serious buyers of Alberta heavy crude at scale. Now they face competition from buyers in 4 Pacific nations, all of whom need reliable heavy crude, and all of whom pay prices reflecting global market conditions rather than North American pipeline discounts. Canada is already locking in this new reality for the long term. Trans Mountain launched a formal open season process in March 2026, a bidding process allowing producers and shippers to commit to long-term transportation contracts on the expanded system. The goal is to convert the spot market usage that characterized the pipeline's early months into a contract book of long-term commitments, which could support further capacity optimization and potentially justify expansion beyond the current 890,000 barrel per day nominal throughput. And if you want the real story behind how Canada is still holding its ground through tariffs, wars, and hard times, hit join below to join the membership for exclusive documentaries you won't see anywhere else about Canada's progress and rise through uncertainty. Reuters reported that Trans Mountain was seeking additional shipper support as Western Canadian export conditions tightened. A pipeline sold to the public partly on the promise that it would provide enough export capacity for a generation of Alberta production is already approaching its own ceiling within 2 years of entering service. The Iran conflict's impact reached beyond the immediate price spike. The Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis examined the implications for Canada's energy sector and found that Middle Eastern supply disruption creates conditions specifically favorable for Canadian heavy crude, because the replacement barrel for Iranian and other Gulf heavy grades must come from a politically stable producer with available export capacity. Canada meets both criteria in a way few comparable volume producers can match. Venezuelan heavy crude remains constrained by sanctions and production declines. Russian Urals crude faces G7 price caps and shipping restrictions. Mexico's Maya grade is declining. The list of alternative heavy crude sources that American Gulf Coast refineries can realistically access at scale when Middle Eastern supply is disrupted is short, and Canada's position on that list strengthened dramatically once Trans Mountain created a competitive market for its crude. An honest reading requires noting the limits. The IEEFA analysis pointed out that the impact on Canadian energy revenues depends on whether the disruption lasts long enough to generate sustained price premiums rather than a short-term spike. The 80% narrowing of the discount was a peak of disruption figure that may not hold as the year's average. But the structural point does not depend on any particular price level. Canada now has Pacific export capacity that prevents American buyers from setting the marginal price of Alberta heavy crude on their own. Even if the Iran disruption eases and WCS returns to a wider discount, that discount will now be set by global market competition rather than by North American pipeline constraints alone. The refineries most exposed are the ones that spent decades depending on cheap Canadian crude. American Gulf Coast facilities configured for heavy crude were built with specific coker units, hydrotreaters, and distillation setups designed to maximize yields from high sulfur, high density oil, exactly like Western Canadian Select. Reconfiguring one of those refineries to process lighter crude requires hundreds of millions of dollars in capital and operational downtime that cuts throughput. They cannot simply switch feedstocks when Canadian crude gets more expensive. They must either compete in the Asian bid market for Canadian barrels or accept margin compression by paying higher feedstock prices into their existing configurations. The engineering that once locked in cheap Canadian supply now locks these refineries into paying whatever the global market demands. And Canada is not finished expanding. Alberta's planned West Coast oil pipeline, targeted for a national interest designation by October 1st, 2026, following the Carney-Smith implementation agreement, would add 1 million barrels per day of Pacific export capacity on top of the 890,000 the Trans Mountain system already provides. In the best case scenario, with construction starting around September 2027, the combined Trans Mountain and new pipeline capacity would exceed 1.89 million barrels per day from Alberta to Pacific Tidewater. Against Alberta's total current production of roughly 3.8 million barrels per day, that would give Pacific export routes access to half of Alberta's output, permanently eliminating the near total American market dependence that let WCS trade at structural discounts for 40 years. The new Asian relationships are already established and durable. The Asia-Pacific Foundation documented that China received the largest single-country share of Trans Mountain-enabled tanker shipments in the second half of 2024, creating a recurring procurement relationship between Chinese refiners and Canadian crude suppliers that did not exist at commercial scale before the expansion. Crucially, unlike American refineries, these buyers have no legacy feedstock configuration forcing them to purchase Canadian crude.